Welcome to the second video of the Blender 2.8 beginners tutorial, where you will learn how to use Blender 2.8 and create this juicy apple scene here from scratch. In this video here we will take a quick look at the user interface and navigation of Blender 2.8, and I will show you the process on how I prepared this scene here, which we will create in this tutorial series. You can find all the timestamps in the video description below, and if you want to follow along you can sign up to our resource section free of charge, and there you can download all the resources and all the videos of this tutorial series. You can find all the important links in the video description below. Hi everyone, Zach here for cgboost.com, and let's get started. For this Blender 2.8 tutorial series, I'm using the currently latest stable version, Blender 2.80. You can download this at blender.org/download. And if you would like to test the currently latest version, which is still in development, so it might not be stable, but you can test all the new features already, head over to builder.blender.org/download and download and test the very latest version there. All the links you find down below in the video description. So before we get started, just one word about my system. I'm using an Intel Core i7 CPU, an NVIDIA graphics card GTX 1080 Ti, and 32 GB of RAM. It's a good system. It might not be the high-end stuff which you can get nowadays, but it's working great with Blender 2.8. So in just a little warning here, Blender 2.8 makes heavy use of your graphics card. That means when you're using a very old graphics card or a very simple graphics card, like an onboard graphics card on your notebook, for example, then it might be that it's not even possible for you to use the real-time render engine in Blender 2.8. Or it might be that it's running relatively slow. So a relatively good graphics card is needed to have fun with Blender 2.8. So with that said, let's take a look at the user interface of Blender 2.8. To hide the splash screen over here, simply left click somewhere here into empty space, and then we have Blender open. As you can see, I've opened the final scene of this tutorial series. If you want to open a project, simply click on File, Open, and then navigate to the file. Here you can see all your hard drives. Over here you can navigate the folders, and then simply click on the blend file and click on Open File. So, because I found it just boring to stare at the basic cube, and since we want to have a look at the navigation and the user interface, it's just more beautiful to look at this scene. So first of all, the user interface of Blender is built up out of different editors. Each editor has a different purpose, and they are separated by these thicker lines over here. So for example, we have this 3D viewport. Up here we have one editor, here this thing down here is also an editor, and we can also change each editor to any other editor. For example, you can see in each editor on the top left we can see a button, and if I click on this button you can see we have all the editor types we can choose from. So for example, if I click up here on this button, the 3D viewport is currently active, but I could change this to anything else, for example the compositor. Don't worry if you don't know what a compositor is. This doesn't matter right now. I just want to show you that you quickly can change each editor to any other editor of your choice. And this you can do for every editor. You can see here we have the same list of editors, and we can change this to anything else if we like. And we could even create another 3D view which shows the same scene just from a different angle and with another viewport shading. So for example, if I move this bowl over here, this will also move over here. So we can basically have the same editor type as often as we like. So let's quickly switch this back to the outliner. Now let's quickly have a look at the default user interface. So this one here, the big editor in the center, is the 3D viewport, where we will work like 90% of the time, because here we create our objects, we paint the textures onto our objects, move them around, etc. So most of the work we do over here. Then up here we have the outliner, which shows us all the objects in our scene. So for example, if I open this up, you can see we have a bunch of apples, we have the fabric, the bowl, the knife, some leaves here, the wooden floor, all this stuff, and also some lamps and a camera, which we can see over here. And as you can see, I packed all these objects into this scene collection. A collection is something like a group or a folder where you can pack all the objects in to organize your scene. So this outliner is awesome to organize your scene and to have a good overview about what's going on in your scene. Then the next important editor is the properties editor down here, which shows you a lot of settings on the one hand scene related. So for example, here we can set up the final output settings when we later on want to generate an image from our 3D scene. We can change the units over here, so everything scene related. And down here we also have a bunch of tabs which are object related. So for example, right now I have the camera selected, and that means that I see all the camera settings down here. But if I select an apple, you can see these icons down here change, and also the settings inside might change a bit depending on what object type you are selecting. So for now, just keep in mind that basically everything we need to set up, we are doing over here in the properties editor. Then down here we have the timeline, which is important for animation and simulations. We will use it at one point later on when we do the claw simulation and a rigid body simulation to fill the bowl with apples. But other than that, we won't cover animation in this tutorial series. So that means most of the time we don't use this timeline down here. So this is a default user interface, but as shown before, we have a lot of other editors which are important for other tasks, but we don't have to change all these editors here manually if we want to texture our objects, for example. We can use the workspaces up here. So here we have a bunch of workspaces which are important for different tasks. So for example, I want to model something, so I can change over to the modeling workspace, and then you can see the layout of our editors is changing, and also the viewport shading, that means how the 3D scene is displayed, and also the mode we are in. As you can see up here, we are now in edit mode. If I go over to layout, we are automatic in object mode. So, and then for example, if I want to do some UV editing, I can switch to the UV editing workspace. Texture painting we can do in the texture painting workspace. Material creation we can do later on in the shading workspace. Then we have one workspace for animation, rendering, compositing, and so on. And we can add even more if we like. So there are even more presets, and we can also duplicate the current one and create our own. Let's get back to layout. And most of the time in this tutorial series we will use these workspaces, but at a few points we will adjust the user interface a little bit to our needs, because we can change the position and count of the editors we have in our user interface. So for example, if I want to have another 3D view, I can simply go to the frame of the current 3D view, right click and click on split area. Now I have this preview line. I can even go to other editors, as you can see. If I don't want to split anything, I simply hit escape. And if you want to split the view, you can simply left click here. And now you can see this current 3D view was separated into two 3D views. As mentioned, this is still the same scene. I can move stuff around and see it in both, but then we can do funny things like show one editor from the camera perspective, and in one other editor, we can move these objects around. This we will do later on. Then, if you, for example, need another editor instead of a second 3D view, you can also click on this button up here again and, for example, change this to the UV editor. And then you have this UV editor here and can work in your 3D scene and also see the UV layout of your objects you're currently working on. If you don't know what a UV layout is, don't worry, we will cover this later in this series. So we can not only split editors vertically, we can also split them horizontally. So if I right click on a vertical line, click on split area, I can also split this window over here and maybe change this to the compositor. So as you can see, we can flexibly change the user interface. Certainly we can also change the size of an editor by moving this around. And certainly we can also remove windows. So if I right click on an edge here, click on join area, I can easily join two windows. So now we are back at the default user interface. So that means later on we don't need the timeline, so we can right click on the edge here, click on join area, move this arrow down here and then left click to remove it. Removing an editor doesn't mean that we delete it and everything we have created with this will be deleted. It's just hidden in the background and at any time we can get it back. So that means if I split this here once again, and for example at the UV editor, you can see that everything which is in here will stay in here because it's saved in this blend file. So we don't lose it. So let's join this once again. And now let's have a quick look at the header of our editors. So each editor has a header, this menu bar up here, also over here. And here on the left, we always have some menus which contain all the tools and functions which we can use for this specific editor. That means if you're looking for a certain feature related to the 3D view and the mode you are currently in, then simply take a look at these here. For example, under View, you find everything which is related to navigation. Under Select, you find everything which is related to selecting objects. Then in the Add menu, you can add new stuff. And in the Object menu, you can execute operations for changing the object. Here you, for example, find the copy and paste function or to delete objects. Depending on what editor you are in, certainly these menus change up here, but you can see we can still find them in every editor. Let's get back to layout. So in some editors on the left and on the right side, you can find these little arrows. If you click on them, these additional menus pop up. On the left, we have the toolbar, which contains important tools related to the mode you are currently in. That means, for example, if I change to edit mode, you can see I have a bunch of more tools. You can also left click and hold when this double arrow appears and move this to the side to see the name of the tools, which can be quite useful. Let's switch back to object mode. And if you want to see the settings of the tools you have selected here, simply click on this button here in the properties editor. And then you can see, depending on what tool you have selected, it will show you additional options. On the sidebar, on the other hand, you can find some additional information for the object you have selected. As you can see here we can see the location, rotation and scale of the current selected object. But we can also find some other information here in these tabs, which we might use later on. To close these menus, you can simply left click and hold on this edge here, move this to the inside. Or you press the shortcuts T for the tool shelf and N for the sidebar. So you can see not every editor has these tool shelf and sidebar, but in some other editors, as you can see here, for example, in the UV editing workspace in the UV editor, if I press here T and N, you can see we also have this tool shelf and this sidebar. With that said, when I use a shortcut, this will only work in the editor my mouse cursor currently hovers above. So if I press T, you can see the tool shelf of this UV editor is opening and closing, but over here from the 3D view, it's not. But if I have my mouse over here and press T and N, you can see I'm only affecting the 3D viewport. So whenever you press a shortcut and realize it's not working, just take a look where your mouse cursor is and then move it back to the editor you're currently working on. Let's get back to layout. Depending on the mode you are in, you can also press right click and then you have this context menu with some important tools and operations which might be important for this mode you are currently in. I'm always talking about modes. Some of the editors have different modes, as I showed you before. For example, if I click up here, you can see the 3D viewport has a bunch of modes. And depending on what task you are currently working on, you can change to other modes. For example, in object mode, we are moving objects around, placing them in our scene. And if we later on want to change the shape of an object, we select the object and go to edit mode, for example. Then we have access to the shape of the object and edit this. For texture painting later on, we also have a different mode, but we won't touch all of them in this tutorial. Let's go back to object mode. So most of the time we work in the 3D viewport, and depending on what task we are doing, we might change the appearance of the viewport to, for example, be able to see the model better when we're modeling something, or to see the textures, or to see the lighting. And here the viewport shading comes into play. Up here we have these 4 balls. This one here is the wireframe viewport shading. As you can see now, the whole scene appears as wireframes, which is quite useful sometimes if you quickly want to see through some objects. Then we have the solid viewport shading, which is perfect for modeling if you want to edit and model your objects or just move objects around. Then we have the look depth viewport shading, which is perfect if you quickly want to adjust your textures and materials, because you can see that we can see all the properties of the materials with all the reflections and all this stuff. And then we have the rendered viewport shading. That means if you set up a lighting in your scene and just want to see how the final scene looks like. So we see all the textures, all the materials, all the lighting, the nice real-time shadows and stuff like this. This rendered viewport shading depends on what render engine you have selected. So if I go over here, you can see the Eevee real-time render engine is enabled, but we can also change this to the Cycles render engine, for example, which we will learn more about later. So let's quickly go over to the looked at viewport shading. And as you can see, we have a bunch of objects here. These rectangles are lamps. This thing here is a camera. And certainly in the final image, in the final rendering, we won't see all these things. We won't see these lines from the viewport with the grid. We won't see this circle thing here, which is the 3D cursor. So, and if you, for example, have the rendered viewport shading enabled, sometimes you just want to see how the final scene looks like without all these helping objects. And for that, you can simply disable the viewport overlays by clicking on this button. Then you just see the final scene without all these helping objects. So then we have the viewport gizmos. For example, if I select an apple here, use the move tool, then you can see we have these arrows here, which help us to use this specific tool we have selected. But if we want to hide these gizmos as well, we can simply click on this button to disable all the gizmos. And if I disable both of them, then I have nothing in my scene anymore. I just see the final result. If you click on these little arrows down here, you can see you have a bunch of additional settings for the viewport gizmos, also for the viewport overlays, and even for example, if I go to the solid viewport shading, if I click on this arrow, we have a lot of settings related to the solid viewport shading, for example. But yeah, as you can see, these are a lot of settings and we won't take a look at all of these here. If we need anything, we will use it while we work on our scene. So a lot of talking about the user interface and the viewport. Now let's finally learn how we can navigate in the 3D viewport. For that, let's quickly switch over to the solid viewport shading to better understand what's going on here. In order to navigate the 3D viewport, we have these gizmos over here. First of all, to rotate the view, simply left click and hold on this circle somewhere, and then you can rotate the view, as you can see. If you click on one of those axes, you also have direct views. We will learn more about this in another video. Let's rotate this again. Then with this magnifier, we can zoom in and out. So simply left click and hold on this and then move your mouse up and down. And with this hand symbol, left click and hold, and then you can move your mouse to pan the view. So if you don't like to use this gizmo up here, you can also navigate using your mouse and your keyboard. For that, it's important that you have a 3-button mouse. That means a mouse with a mouse wheel. If you don't have that, if you're, for example, using a notebook with a trackpad, I will show you in a second how you can emulate this 3-button mouse. So first of all, if you click the middle mouse button, so if you click on your mouse wheel and hold and then move the mouse, you can rotate your view. It's the same as left clicking over here and move this. Then if you hold down Shift, middle mouse button click and move your mouse, you can pan the view. And by simply scrolling the mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out, or you use Control and middle mouse button click and then move your mouse up and down to have a more smooth zooming in and out. So sometimes it appears when you're moving around, your camera gets stuck at any point, and there's a quick solution to get out of these. I'm pretty sure you will experience this at some point. If this happens, simply left click, select an object, and then simply press the period button on your keyboard, on the numpad. That's important, not the period which is located by the letters. This won't work. And this centers the view and also the selected object. And now if I navigate around, this is centered, as you can see. And this is a feature I use all the time, which makes navigation in Blender much more convenient. So this is something you should remember. And if you don't have a numpad, simply go to View and click on Frame Selected. So when you don't have a numpad or a 3-button mouse, you can emulate this. For that, simply go to Edit, Preferences. Then this window pops up, and here we can adjust some of the preferences, so general settings for Blender. And as soon as you change anything here, this will be saved automatically. That means if you close and reopen Blender, all the settings you have changed here will stay intact. So here let's go to Input, and if you don't have a numpad, you can emulate the numpad. And if you don't have a 3-button mouse, you can emulate the 3-button mouse. So in Blender, the numpad numbers and the numbers above the letters are two different things. However, if you use emulate numpad, the numbers above the letters become the numpad numbers, basically. Later on, you will learn how to use the numpad for changing views, for example, but this we will learn while we go. And if you, for example, use a notebook with a trackpad and no middle mouse button, you can emulate the 3-button mouse. So instead of middle mouse button click, you press left click and Alt. So if I now left click and Alt, you can see that I also can rotate. With Control, Alt and left click, I can zoom in and out. And with Shift, Alt and left click, I can pan my view. So in my case, I don't need that, so I disable that. And the second thing I want to show you here, go to System. And here under Memory Limits, we find the undo steps, which are set to 32 by default. Let's click in here and change the number to 256, which is the maximum undo steps we can do. So if you press Ctrl Z later on to undo something, you can do it 256 times. Or if you want to redo anything, you can press Ctrl Shift Z. So a lot of talking, but I think this is necessary to just get a rough idea of how the user interface works. So before we now start to create the 3D scene, I want to give you some insights about how I prepared the scene and what my process were to get to the final idea for the 3D scene we are creating in this tutorial series. So first of all, my initial idea was I wanted to create an example scene for this beginner tutorial series, which is simple enough so that beginners can follow, but on the other hand, it still should look really nice and impressive in the end. After thinking about it a while, I remembered that I created a still life scene back in 2014, if I remember right, for a beginner workshop I held in Germany. And this scene, besides other things, also contained a bowl with apples and other fruits, which from my perspective today doesn't look cool at all. However, this was one inspiration I got, and then I remembered that in 2016 I created an animated scene with a wooden box full of vegetables, also for a beginner workshop I held in Germany. And I really liked the idea to put something like this into a tutorial series. However, the wooden box with the vegetables would be a bit too much stuff to create for a series, so the series would be even longer. Then I thought about it, how I can simplify the whole thing, and I basically came back to the still life idea with just a bunch of apples. So I had the basic idea in mind, and then I searched on Pinterest for apple photography, and I found some really nice images which I put together in a pinboard. And then I don't took one image and exactly recreated this in 3D. I just took inspiration from different images and put them together as my own final idea. In the end, I didn't have a concept image or anything like that. I just started to create the scene in 3D and iterated on it until I had a finished scene I like. That means I created the full scene before I even started to record the tutorials. In this way, I knew exactly where the object should be placed, what settings I want to use for all these textures and materials, and so on and so forth. So I can keep these tutorials as short as possible and put only important information into these videos. So in general, it's really important to understand that it takes time to create a 3D scene, and it won't be perfect just by the first try. You have to iterate on that. You have to change your models. You have to change your lighting and texturing. So iterate as much as possible, and also ask your friend, colleagues, or in online groups for feedback. And if you got some valuable feedback, implement it into your scene and iterate again until you have something which you really like. But don't waste too much time in tweaking small things, because in the end it's also important to finish your project and then start a next one and make it even better with all the things you have learned. So when it comes to creating something in 3D, don't just rely on your mind. The number one thing you need always are references. Whether it be photos you find online or you took on yourself, whether it be real objects you can hold in your hand, or maybe concept drawings for objects which maybe don't exist in the real world. But you need references to understand how objects interact with each other, how the proportions are, how the materials look like, etc. So for my scene, it was relatively simple. So I grabbed some apples, I grabbed a knife and some other objects, and then I could measure these objects so I know exactly how big they are. I know how the surface looks when I want to create the materials later on. I took some photos of the objects which we will use as textures later on and adjusted them to my needs in Photoshop and Pixblend, which are my tools to quickly create some textures out of photographs. But in this tutorial series, we concentrate on the 3D part only. That means I won't show you how to adjust textures in Photoshop or other image editors. There are many online libraries of free textures to download. I highly recommend texturehaven.com. And in the video description below, I also listed you some other sites where you can download free textures. Here's a small tip for better learning. Don't simply follow and recreate everything I will show you in these tutorials. To better learn and understand how you can use all the tips and tricks and workflows I show you onto your own projects, add your own twist to the scene. So for example, you could create a similar scene, but instead of apples, you use pears or bananas or something like that, or add some additional objects to the scene. So play around with all the techniques and tips and tricks I will show you so that you understand how to apply all of that to other projects as well. But certainly if you're just starting out and this is too complicated for you, it's totally fine to also just follow this tutorial. So guys, now you have a rough idea on how Blender's user interface works, how you can navigate in Blender, and how to prepare a 3D project. If you enjoy this video, make sure to like it, subscribe, and tell your friends about it. And let me know in the comment section below if this is your first try to learn Blender or if you have some experience already. By the way, if you like what we are doing and want to get deeper into learning Blender, check out our online courses at academy.cgboost.com. There you also find the Blender 2.8 Launchpad course, which is an in-depth and very comprehensive course on getting into Blender 2.8, which you might enjoy as well. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Now click on the next video where we will learn how to model the apple for the 3D scene, and I will see you there. Goodbye.